Hello everyone and welcome back to the main stage here at FTT Identity. I hope you're having a fantastic day so far. There's been an incredible amount of sessions and panels already on our main stage today with some fantastic discussions, so I hope you're enjoying listening to them as much as I have been. But right now, I'm delighted to be joined by Diane Joyce, and we're going to be chatting today about inclusion and diversity in identity systems. So thank you very much for joining me, Diane. And before we get into this topic, if I could ask you just to briefly introduce yourself for our audience here today.
Thanks, Laura. And it's great to be here today because just discussing such an important topic of diversity and inclusion. So a little bit about me. I'm bilocated in both Wellington, New Zealand and London. So I'm here in the sunshine in New Zealand. I have worked in the digital identity and cybersecurity industry for many years. I'm an innovator and a disruptor. I like to challenge the status quo. And being a technologist at heart, I think we can always do better. So I would say my mantra would be that I'm committed to providing the users of digital services with an experience built on security, convenience and transparency. A favourite saying of mine is, use the technology to take the heavy lifting off the user. I've worked in both the public and private sectors and worked with governments in both their government gov.uk Verify program as an IDP, but also on the standards body. I've worked in pan-government identity space and I really enjoy it.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you very much. And Diane, at present, you're an executive member of Women in Identity, who you're representing here today. So could you just tell us a little bit more about Women in Identity? You know, what are some of your goals and your real vision, I suppose, for the future of the identity sector?
Yes, I am a volunteer on the executive for the Women in Identity. We're a not-for-profit organisation. We're staffed entirely by volunteers and we actively promote diversity and inclusion in the digital identity industry. We want to ensure that digital identity solutions are built for everyone and that they're built by everyone. So we're committed to diversity. We champion a more diverse workforce, inclusive of all to enter and work and to advance in the identity industry. This is to reduce bias and to develop identity systems and solutions that, as I say, work for everyone. We're also a catalyst for change. We provide industry thought leadership, research, education around bias, diversity and inclusion, and its importance in the identity industry and also the orthogonal industries as well. And we are creators of opportunity. We like to provide opportunities for more diverse representations across industry events. And that's diversity in relation to gender, age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, social status. And we like to do that for both speakers and contributors and also attendances at audience. And whilst our name states Women in Identity, it was because it was started by a bunch of women, but actually we're totally inclusive. We want to shake up the identity industry so anyone is welcome to join, and it's free to join. Come join us.
Fantastic. No, I love that. Anyone in identity, I suppose, could be the new name. No, that's brilliant. Incredible, inspiring work you're doing, and we're really privileged to have you here today. So when we talk about inclusion in identity systems, I suppose really it's important to start by looking at those who are not included, you know, those who are excluded from identity systems and from financial services. So perhaps we could start by taking a look into that. So can you tell us a little, who are the types of individuals and the groups of people around the world who are excluded in this way? And you know, why is it that these particular groups are excluded?
Sure. Unsurprisingly, identity exclusion is closely associated with social and economic exclusion. Financial services and products tend to be the starting point for establishing a digital identity, but it's also the starting point for exclusion. So, excuse me, I see three key demographic profiles that lead to exclusion. The first is people who cannot meet the legal requirements to get access to financial products and services. Many groups, such as migrants, are unable to provide the documents required by law to prove their identity and their place of residence. Without these, they can't even access basic banking services. And basic banking services is often the stepping point into financial inclusion. The second group are those who cannot afford the cost of digital services. In today's world of moving to an online world, with many organisations no longer having in-person premises or restricting in-person premises to lesser areas, people need digital devices and internet access to get services. But this just isn't possible for everyone. Not everyone has access to the internet. Not everyone has the right kind of digital devices. And I think the third group is people who lack the skills and ability or even the means to access financial services. So this includes the vulnerable who often live on the fringes of society, the illiterate, those with physical and mental disabilities, but it also includes those who live in remote locations without the technology infrastructure to help them. No internet, no social ability to connect. And whilst those three groups are, people might say some of those are third world examples, but in fact, actually, I think these apply across the world. It's just the numbers of the profiles are different in different parts of the world.
Mm. No, absolutely. And so when we speak about building identity systems for everyone, we need to look at those groups that you've identified there. How can we address the fact that they're excluded and the reasons they're excluded? And I suppose what I'm asking is there a way to make identity systems more inclusive to those groups who have traditionally been left out?
I think there definitely is. There's a number of things we can do. I think the first thing we have to do is start with the regulations in the financial services industry, specifically the AML, KYC legal requirements for getting access to financial services. At the moment, we have strong customer identification, and these need to evolve to meet the needs of a more diverse customer base. Because generally, it requires a verified identity that's based on a government created document and collaborating proof of address documents. We know not everyone has those. So, if we could move to a better way of identifying people, maybe triangulating identity from multiple sources, not just a government document, and to provide a really rich identity background and one that works in the first, second, and third worlds. And I think one of the key ways that we can do this, and it's starting to evolve in our identity industry, is vouching. So it's a great way for starting to create an identity. A doctor can vouch for a patient. A chief can vouch for a tribe member. A teacher can vouch for a pupil. A religious leader can vouch for a person. Social workers can vouch for their clients. Governments can vouch for their citizens. Employers can vouch for employees. The list goes on and on and on. And whilst some of these might seem quite lightweight in the current needs for identity under the current regulations, in fact, they become stronger as we collect more and more information, attestations about the people. And I'm talking about attestations. My doctor can say I'm 18 because my doctor knows my date of birth. And so we can start to build from that, from the very beginning, we can start to establish an identity and start to triangulate across different sources. Of course, having a digital identity doesn't solve the issue of the cost of financial services, which is just as much a barrier to online services. And I think, secondly, we need to address how identity systems are built. It's really great having an app that provides your digital identity and you can take it everywhere and use it and get access to other digital identity services. But I think identity system designers need to consider a couple of key principles. Design for minimum data exchange. Not all users have access to unlimited data. Not all users have access to Wi-Fi, and they can't afford the mobile internet data charges. So let's design apps that are less chatty and don't cost the user so much to use and that can work in an offline mode. I think the second design principle is design for everyone to be able to use. Think about those with both physical and mental disabilities. Will they be able to use your service? And the third one, design for privacy. Don't ask for data or share data that isn't necessary. So that would be the ways that I would approach inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many factors to consider, isn't there? But that concept of vouching is really interesting to me. It's sort of, I suppose, when you're, for example, applying for a new job, you would take a reference as a solid form of
Mm-hmm.
identity. That the fact that that person has, worked in the previous role that they are saying that they have. So,
Mm-hmm.
as you say, why is there such a reason that we can't do that in other cases in our daily life? As you say, a doctor can categorically prove your date of birth, that you're above a certain age. So that's yeah, really interesting to explore. Is that something that's being put into practice in certain, is it in certain areas? Is it something that we're seeing work and have an impact, do you think?
I think it is. I think it's starting more in the third world at the moment, particularly because a lot of refugees and migrants don't necessarily have documentation. So as the NGOs start to see them more and more, they can vouch that this is the same person they've seen again and again. And as you start to build that up, so yes, it is. But I think we need to move it into um, our world as well, in the first world countries, because not everyone does have government documentation.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. You're completely right. A lot of the times, the conversation around the inclusion does tend to center a lot on developing countries, but absolutely that we can't ignore the fact that there are inclusion issues in the
Mm-hmm.
most developed countries as well. You mentioned earlier, actually, through obviously the pandemic and the situation over the last year, it's really meant that certain in-person relations that people rely on aren't able to happen and to go ahead. Do you think it's shown up in a way and highlighted a lot of the issues around inclusion? Do you think even more so than previously?
Oh, definitely, because previously there were places, in-person centres that people could go to, and if you think about those who are on the fringes of society, they would often use post offices and social welfare centres to go in and do everything. And of course, they're not open, or they're really restricted. And so, very much, there's people I think who have been marginalised even further. They were on the fringes of society, and now, they're really struggling. So, I think the COVID pandemic has definitely identified that we need to do something smarter with digital identity, and also how important it is.
Mm, mm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Could completely agree. And you mentioned at the end of, when you were speaking about ways that we can address these reasons for exclusion, you mentioned privacy. Obviously, it's kind of a double-edged sword in a way. So, how do you balance empowering individuals with credentials, but also ensuring that their personal information is protected? I think this is a really important consideration.
It really is, and it is a balance, because if we look, technology makes digital identity easier for people, but it does come with the risk of privacy. And I don't think we need to provide so much data to so many organisations just to prove who I am. Every organisation I give my data to is a greater risk of my data being breached and used by fraudulent actors. But the balance between minimal and optimal data it's a big challenge. On one hand, we want to reduce the friction from the users, and to do that, we need data. So, artificial intelligence is often used to identify normal behavior of a user to reduce the friction. But this requires vast amounts of data on the user behavior and fingerprinting that user to achieve that. But if we look at the other hand, we don't want all of this data, because as an organisation, it's one of our biggest risks now to have this data due to the numbers of breaches occurring. And, GDPR has shown that it's expensive should you get breached. And I think from the point of view of data provided by the user, we can definitely change the way we do authentications and assertions. Historically, we've exchanged personal data when we're providing an authentication, and we exchange that to third party systems, and then they store that data as well. And I don't think we need to do that. And I think the use of decentralized identity is going to be a great step forward in dealing with privacy. If we look at the verifiable credentials approach, where I'm the owner of my identity and can share an attestation rather than the data is important. Now, an attestation means I'm not sharing the data. It's a little like the vouching. I'm sharing that someone in authority that is recognisable can vouch for me. And so instead of giving my name, address and date of birth to get access to age-based services, I can exchange an assurance from a reliable source that says I'm over the age. Like I said, my doctor could do that. So a simple yes, Diane is over the age is all that's required. There's no need for the organisation that needs to know that I'm over the age. They don't need to know my name, my address, my date of birth. They just need to be able to trust the reliable source. And yeah, so I think there are definitely ways that we can move this forward. But I think the real concern with privacy for me is the smarter our devices get, the more data they consume about us, the more they want to know, and the more they track and fingerprint us. So I do think our legislation like GDPR needs to be enforced to make sure that our data is safe and that only the data that is really required is being kept about us.
Completely. And I can see this concept of decentralized identity being really, really powerful to give users back control over their personal data and the amount of information that's shared. But I wonder, often when you hear talk of decentralized identity, sort of some of the core components of that concept is that, it gives a user a portable kind of credential that they have power over, and can kind of take between their different interactions. I wonder how that works with the inclusion element of those who have kind of a lack of access to technology. Does that cause some kind of a conflict there?
Do you know, I think it does. And I think that's where the smart use of verifiable credentials, everything needs to be available in the offline world. So if they don't have devices, then we need to have some way of them accessing verifiable credentials, either in person, because they will be there doing something. So they should be able to identify themselves in some way that should be able to go off and they can authorize their verifiable credential to come in. I think the other exciting thing about verifiable credentials, though, is they could be used offline easily. They don't necessarily require data from the consumer to use. Now, the relying party will need to go back and verify the verifiable credential, but if I have it on my phone and I can scan a QR code and give it to a relying party in the face-to-face channel, they can then use their systems to go back and verify that that credential is correct. So I think it does help in some ways, but we haven't quite got all the infrastructure in place yet to make it accessible for everyone.
Yeah. No, absolutely. There's just so many factors to consider, isn't there? But certainly, lots of ways to move in the right direction, I think. So, taking as well, we'd love to chat about this issue of diversity and kind of diversity both in identity systems and in the people creating these identity systems. So, from your perspective, do you think that we do have a sort of an issue with bias in digital identity systems? And do you think that there's enough being done to combat this issue? And what more could be done to combat this issue? It's a big question, I know, but
It is. Yes, we definitely have issues with bias in identity systems. There have been a number of examples of this already, from facial recognition not recognizing light or dark-skinned people, apps designed for right-handed people, apps that are designed and anyone with a disability is unable to use them. And when I think about bias, I think that there are two types of bias. One is the conscious bias, where the decisions are made with a deliberate bias towards a target audience. And so this might be organisations that decide their target audience is only a subset of people. And so that they consciously make that decision. And I think then there's the unconscious bias, and this is where it's not deliberate. And it tends to stem from learned stereotypes about people that everyone forms without even realizing it. And it includes many social stereotypes about individuals, groups, or groups of people, and we all have that, and it's just one of those things we can do. We can definitely start to look at. I've been to a number of bias workshops where I think, I champion bias. No, I'm not biased, and I suddenly step back and think, oh, my stereotyping from the way I think and my beliefs and I behave are not necessarily the same. So I think the first thing is to accept that we all have bias and that our teams will be biased. And I think you can overcome implicit bias by first discovering what your blind spots are, and then actively working to dismiss the stereotypes and attitudes. And you can do that by having diversity in your team so that you start to see other perspectives. And the more diverse your team is, the more you learn from each other, and the wider you tend to focus. And I think another thing is really to encourage your teams to discuss bias and diversity. Make it part of your system development lifecycle, that you actually look at it and say, do we have enough diversity in this product that we're looking at? And don't leave it right to the end, where we often do when we go into user labs and things like that. And it's a bit late then because it's pretty expensive to fix. And another thing is, have a diversity bias champion. And if you're in a team, maybe you rotate that around your team so everybody gets to do that. Everybody gets to be a champion for a month, for a product, for a run, for a cycle, whatever it is. And I think that's quite important, because then everyone gets to buy into it. And another thing is, don't design the system as if you're your own user. I'm a technologist at heart, so I'm going to design a technology elegant solution that someone with disabilities may not be able to use. And I think that's really important. And I think probably the final thing is, make sure the data you're testing with is diverse. And that's where a lot of the bias has come out in identity systems. The data sets didn't include the light-skinned people. The data sets didn't include the dark-skinned people. So very much make sure the data you're testing with is diverse. But the key one, make your teams diverse.
No, absolutely. I can see how that would be so crucial to dealing with unconscious bias in particular, because as you say, you're not aware of the fact that you're being biased in that way. That's the nature of the unconscious bias. So, unless you make an active effort to challenge that and look at perspectives beyond your own and make sure you're having those perspectives represented in your team, that's really what's needed, isn't it? I think to overcome that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, fantastic. So I wonder if we could end on today. So you've mentioned a couple of great suggestions already there, having the diversity champion, for example. But for everyone listening who, is perhaps considering how they can champion actively diversity and inclusion more in their organizations, what would be your practical recommendations for our audience on how to really drive forward diversity and inclusion in their everyday work and their industry?
I think if I start at the organizational level, have a diversity and inclusion champion for the organisation and make it a role. Don't make it a part-time, someone also does, they're a developer or they're senior manager and they do it. Make it a role and have them reporting in at a senior level and empower them to engage everyone in the organisation. And I think the second thing an organisation can do is think about diversity, how you address it in recruitment. So think about the wording of your job descriptions. Eliminate words like go-getter, competitive, driven, guru. My favourite is expert. I don't know many experts. I see so many jobs where expert in this with 20 plus years. Trim it down. Trim down the skills required to the essentials and remove the desirable, because one of the things that stops women applying for jobs is they don't meet 100% of the skills and they never consider themselves an expert, and therefore they go, oh, well, that's not for me. I think the other thing organisations can do is have a flexible recruiting policy. change the way you recruit. Make sure you've got diversity in your interviewing teams. Be flexible to different types of recruiting, whether it starts with a coffee chat, whether it starts with something slightly more informal than going straight into a panel, because that does put a lot of women off. And, we
Absolutely,
need
yeah.
that diversity.
Absolutely, no, that it can be intimidating, the interview process, can't it? So I think that's so important, starting out from the beginning, to make sure you're attracting the types of diverse teams that you want to have on board, right from the job description, making sure you've got those people applying so that you can choose from an application pool that's quite diverse, I suppose. We don't have too much time left for our conversation, which is a shame, because I've really, really enjoyed chatting to you today, Diane. I think there's been some incredibly important areas that we've discussed, and some really practical, I think, recommendations to take forward for everybody listening, which is great. But you mentioned at the beginning, when we started speaking, you mentioned come join us at Women in Identity. So I just would love to ask, before we close, how can we do this, and can anyone do this? Is it open to all of us? How do we come and join you at Women in Identity?
Yes, you absolutely can. It's free to join. And if you go to www.womaninidentity.org and /join, and it's free. Everyone can join. Anyone is welcome, and anyone who wants to change the digital identity industry. Let's just do it.
Fantastic. Well, what a note to end on. Thank you very much, Diane, for joining me. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll be right back on the main stage shortly with our next session. Thank you.